In April 1966, at a hospital in Winnipeg, a doctor was about to circumcise an 8-month-old baby named Bruce Reimer. But the doctor made a huge mistake, and the surgery went terribly wrong. Over the next few days, Bruce Reimer's penis dried up and fell off, meaning he would never live a normal life as a man. His parents were devastated until a different doctor came up with a plan. They would take the male baby and try to raise it as a girl. However, this ended up being a catastrophe. In this video, we're going to reveal the full story of Bruce Reimer from his birth to his tragic end. On August 22nd, 1965, Bruce was born in Winnipeg along with his identical twin brother, Brian. Their parents, Ron and Janet, were young, working class, and they had 2 healthy boys who looked exactly alike. At around 6 months old, both twins were diagnosed with a condition called phimosis, where the foreskin is too tight, and their family doctor recommended a routine circumcision. On April 27, 1966, Janet left both boys at the hospital for the procedure. The next morning, the regular surgeon was unavailable, so a general practitioner named Dr. Jean-Marie Hewitt stepped in. Hewitt decided to use an electrocautery machine, a device that cuts and seals tissue with electrical current instead of a standard scalpel. Something went wrong with the machine on the first procedure, and Bruce's penis was destroyed in seconds. Brian's circumcision was canceled immediately, and his foreskin would later loosen on its own without any surgery at all. For Ron and Janet, what followed was almost a year of silence from the medical world. The doctors they consulted told them there was nothing that could be done because the technology to rebuild a penis did not exist in 1966, and their son would grow up unable to function sexually or even urinate while standing. They were told to take him home and prepare for a difficult life. But then, in one night, in February 1967, Janet turned on the television. A Canadian news program called This Hour Has 7 Days was interviewing a psychologist from Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, the most prestigious medical institution in North America. His name was Dr. John Money, and he was talking about gender, a word he had helped invent in its modern sense, and about how a child's identity as a boy or a girl was shaped not by biology but by upbringing. He sounded calm and authoritative, and he was talking about cases where the sex of a child had been changed at birth with what he called complete success. Full of hope, Janet wrote to him that week. A few weeks later, Ron and Janet flew to Baltimore with their 22-month-old son, thinking they were going to see a doctor. But little did they know that they were going to an experiment. John Money was 45 years old in 1967, a sexologist at Johns Hopkins who had built his career studying intersex children and who had coined the term gender identity itself. His central theory, which he called psychosexual neutrality, held that a child was born neither male nor female in the mind, and that by raising a child consistently as one or the other before the age of 2, you could make them that gender for life. Money had tested the theory on intersex children before, but he had never tested it on a normal, healthy child until Bruce Reimer came into his office. Money told the Reimers that if they agreed to castrate their son, to raise him as a girl, and to never tell him the truth, their child could grow up as a happy and well-adjusted woman. He told them the window for this was closing because the child was already nearly 2, and the decision had to be made quickly. The Reimers agreed. On July 3, 1967, when he was 22 months old, surgeons at Johns Hopkins removed Bruce's testicles and built a rudimentary vulva. From that day on, he was called Brenda. What most people did not know at the time, and what most people still do not know today, is that this was the first time a sex reassignment surgery had ever been performed on an infant born with normal genitalia. Every previous case had involved an intersex child, meaning a child born with ambiguous physical sex characteristics. Bruce had been a healthy boy, but he was now the test case for whether Money's theory could be applied to anyone. If it worked on him, it could become routine practice everywhere. The Reimers were instructed to bring Brenda back to Baltimore once a year for psychological follow-up, and they did so for over a decade. Brian came along too, because Money needed the identical twin as a comparison, what scientists call a control. Money described what he did during those annual visits as therapy, but according to David's later accounts and his brothers, the sessions involved something else entirely. Starting around age 6, Money would have the twins remove their clothes and inspect each other's genitals. He had them simulate sex acts together. Photographs were taken, and on at least one occasion, Money brought up to 6 colleagues into the room to observe. When the children resisted, Money would shout at them. David later remembered him screaming, "Don't you want to be a normal girl?" The twins came to dread the trips to Baltimore, but they never told their parents what was happening behind the closed door of the office. They thought every child went through this, because Money had told them so. In 1972, Money published a book called Man and Woman, Boy and Girl, in which he announced Brenda's case as a triumph. He described her as a happy, feminine little girl, well adjusted to her assigned gender, vindicating his theory entirely. Time magazine covered the story. The case entered medical textbooks across North America, and Money's framework became the standard explanation for how gender worked in human beings. Doctors began using the same approach on intersex infants as a matter of routine, citing Brenda as proof that it worked. But Brenda was not what Money said she was. From the earliest childhood, she had refused the role. When her mother put her in her first dress, she tried to rip it off. She preferred her brother's toys, played with his trucks, and urinated standing up despite being punished for it. She took apart her toy sewing machine with a screwdriver she had stolen from her father's toolkit. At school, the other children called her gorilla and cave woman because she walked, talked, and moved like a boy, and because nothing about her matched the girl she was supposed to be. Brian, who was meant to be the control, was falling apart in his own way. He resented the attention his twin got from doctors, struggled in school, and would later be diagnosed with schizophrenia and severe depression. In 1979, a BBC documentary series called Open Secret aired the first public skepticism about the case, interviewing Brenda's local doctors in Canada who described an unhappy child who was nothing like the well-adjusted girl Money had described in print. Money dismissed the criticism, but inside the Reimer family, the situation was reaching a breaking point. By the time Brenda was 13, she had threatened suicide more than once. She told her parents that if they ever made her see Dr. Money again, she would take her life. On March 14, 1980, Ron Reimer took his 14-year-old child out for ice cream. A psychiatrist had warned the family that Brenda might actually go through with her threat. In the car afterward, sitting in the parking lot, Ron told her the whole story about the circumcision in 1966, about the surgery in Baltimore, about the name she had been given as a baby, and about the fact that she had been born a boy. But Brenda did not cry. She did not break down, and in her own words years later, she said, "Suddenly, it all made sense why I felt the way I did. I wasn't some sort of weirdo. I wasn't crazy." Within weeks, the child who had been called Brenda chose a new name for himself. He picked David, after the biblical David who had fought Goliath, and he later told a reporter that the name reminded me of courage. Over the next few years, David began taking testosterone, had his breasts removed in a double mastectomy, and underwent a surgical procedure called a phalloplasty to construct a penis. The result was functional enough that he could have sex and orgasm, But he could not father children because his testicles had been gone since he was a baby. David never went back to John Money and never spoke to him again. In September 1990, when David was 25, he married a woman named Jane Fontaine and adopted her 3 children, becoming a stepfather to 2 boys and a girl. He worked at a slaughterhouse and various odd jobs around Winnipeg, and for a few years his life was something close to ordinary, but the world still knew nothing about him. Meanwhile, in Hawaii, a sexologist named Milton Diamond had been trying to find him for almost 30 years. Diamond was Money's longtime academic rival. Since the 1960s, he had argued that gender identity had biological roots, not just learned ones. And he always doubted that Money's famous twin case could possibly have gone as well as Money claimed. But Money had refused to share any follow-up information after the early 1980s, and the medical journals had stopped publishing on the case entirely. Diamond did not know if the child was even alive, or what name they used, or where they lived. However, in 1995, through David's local psychiatrist, Keith Sigmundson, Diamond finally tracked him down. David agreed to talk because he wanted to make sure no other child ever went through what he had gone through. In March 1997, Diamond and Sigmundson published a paper in the Archives of Pediatrics and Adolescent Medicine, laying out the truth. One of the most famous cases in modern sexology had been a complete failure. The story spread fast. In December of that year, the journalist John Colapinto published a long article about David in Rolling Stone magazine, which won a National Magazine Award. 3 years later, Colapinto's book, As Nature Made Him, became a New York Times bestseller, and David appeared on Oprah Winfrey's television program to tell his story to millions of viewers. On television, David said, "I wore dresses on occasion, and I never played with girls' stuff. You don't wake up one morning and say, 'Oh, I'm a boy today.' It's in you. Nobody has to tell you who you are." In another interview, he said, "I had parts of my body cut away and thrown in a waste paper basket. I've had my mind ripped away." But the exposure did not heal him. His brother Brian had been deteriorating for years, and in July 2002, Brian was found dead from an overdose of antidepressants and barbiturates. He was 36 years old. The official cause was an overdose, but his family believed it was deliberate. For the next 2 years, David visited his brother's grave every single day. In 2003, David lost about $65,000 in an investment scheme run by a man named Gary Perch, who had been under warning by the Manitoba Securities Commission. The money had been a large portion of what David had earned from the book and the speaking circuit, and losing it sent him into a serious depression. Then, also, his marriage began to fail. On May 2nd, 2004, Jane told him she wanted a separation. His brother and money were gone, and on top of that, his marriage was ending. 2 days later, on May 4th, 2004, David Reimer drove to a parking lot in Winnipeg and killed himself with a sawed-off shotgun at the age of 38. He was buried in St. Vital Cemetery beside his twin brother. John Money was 82 years old when David died. He had stopped publicly discussing the case after 1980, but he had never admitted that the experiment had failed. In 1998, he published a list of reasons why the reassignment might not have worked the way he had predicted. The surgery had been done too late. The parents had been traumatized by the accident, and the presence of a male twin had been a confounding factor. Colleagues said privately that he was mortified by what had happened. He died on July 7th, 2006, of complications from Parkinson's disease, 2 years and 2 months after the boy whose case had built his reputation. What David's story changed was real. After the truth came out, the practice of performing sex reassignment surgery on healthy infant boys with penile injuries effectively stopped. Medical schools that had taught Money's theory began teaching the opposite. Doctors who treated intersex children started asking different questions. and many stopped performing irreversible surgeries on infants too young to consent. Thank you for watching. If you want to support the channel, subscribe, and watch this next video about a child that was raised with a chimpanzee.